We're down to ones and twos coming in, so I think I will start. Can I remind you that if you're not speaking, to please put yourself on mute. We have a larger group this evening, so would appreciate that. I'm Marcy Larson. I'm the VP of Marketing and Communications at Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I want to welcome you to our first One Museum, One Book book club of 2021. And we are starting off the year with probably a very appropriate book for a new year, and especially after the year we've had, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Our moderator for this evening is Lori, Lori O'Hara.
Okay.
Sorry, I had a brain fart. And I'm excited to have her moderate. She's participated in many of our book clubs with very insightful remarks. And I want to tell you a little bit about her. Lori's married with 2 daughters and is a licensed clinical social worker with 35 plus years of experience. She's worked with adolescents as a school social worker in junior high in Lincolnshire, and also in private practice with adolescents and young adults. She's also worked in therapeutic day schools and residential programs. She is an avid reader, always been interested in the Holocaust, and became a docent at our museum in November of 2017. So with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Lori after I talk a little bit about how this will work tonight. So Wendy Singer, who is our Director of Education, is here with me, and we're going to help get your questions to Lori. So if you have a question, for some of you who've been here in the past, we had you raise your hand like you're seeing me. That's not going to work tonight because our group is too big and we can't see everyone's faces. So please, if you have a question, use your participant button. There's a little arrow. You can click up on it, and there's an icon that says raise your hand. That will put you to the top of the participants list, and Wendy will let Lori know that you have a question. You also can type it into the chat, and Lori will recognize it and read it, or I will read it, or Wendy will read it. So 2 ways to participate. Use the participant button or type it into the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lori.
Thank you. Well, welcome to everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. We have an hour to delve into an extremely influential book. In fact, it's been identified as one of the 10 most influential books in the United States. And as of April 2020, over 16 million copies were sold in 50 languages. So tonight, through our discussion, I'd like us to explore Frankl's theories and ideas, look at the merits and the takeaways, and also perhaps some of the criticisms. I hope we can examine these somewhat abstract ideas and really consider how they can be applied to our lives today. So in very brief summary of the book, between 1942 and 1945, psychiatrist Viktor Frankl was in 4 different concentration camps, including Auschwitz. During that time, his parents, brother, and pregnant wife were put to death. Based on his own experiences and observations, Frankl argues that we cannot avoid suffering, but we can choose how to cope with it, find meaning in it, and move forward with renewed purpose. His theory, which is known as Logotherapy, holds that our primary drive in life is not pleasure, as Freud had maintained at that time, or power, as Adler believed, but the discovery and pursuit of what we personally and individually find meaningful. So Frankl was born in 1905 and died in 1997. Man's Search for Meaning was first published in 1946 in Vienna, and then in America in 1959. So I'm very curious about how many of you actually read this book much earlier in your lives and how many are reading it now for the first time. So as you comment, it would be great if you could let us know when you share if this is new or if this is something you've read, quite a while ago. So there's a lot of Holocaust literature, and I'm guessing that many of us have read quite a bit of it. Why do you think we continue to read it? And what do you think was different and unique about what Frankl had to say. So use your raise hand function. And I'm going to say to Wendy and Marcy, I'm not sure I can see the raised hands. So if you can, you want to call on people?
Yeah, nothing yet, but I do see some things, Marcy, in the chat.
I see people are talking about when they first read it, high school, college.
Yes, Marcy, you're on mute, so I'll read a couple of these chats. They said they first read it in high school. They read it a few times. It meant so much to me. In college, probably my first introduction to the Holocaust. What he offered was pro et ovole. About a decade ago, not now. And now again with new appreciation. And some are reading it for the first time and some have read it long ago.
Okay, I'm seeing a comment that says raised hand feature not available in participants.
Okay, we will take care of that. Let me look at it.
Okay, and I'm going to just throw out again, the first thing that I would love to hear from people as soon as we can get that going is, what do you think was unique and different about what Frankl had to say from some of the other commentary about the Holocaust? Any thoughts on that?
I have a thought. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure.
Oh, hi, my name's Frida Ankin, and it's like such a pleasure to always be part of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. It's dear to my heart. I think everyone has different places they come from, and my parents were survivors. And I was told, which is interesting, I'm like 3/4 of the way done. I was told to read this, and my daughter, who's 43, we both had people last year, independent of each other, who told us to read this. I'm going to be brief. I think it's an incredible account of Viktor Frankl, his ability to express himself, his ability to, I kept underlining, to talk about how he and why how he survived and why he survived. I haven't read a bunch of books on the Holocaust. I've read some, but I found this, I didn't read it initially because I thought, I don't know if I can read all this. This was an amazing book for me personally to read. I just have to tell you a quick story about my father. And that's one reason I think someone told Amy and me to read it. Amy was best friends with her Zadie. My dad was in Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, and liberated from Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and Dachau. And my dad went through the camps with his brother, Henry. So Henry was 16 in 39, 41, 43, and dad was 18. And dad's mom said to him, Joe, Yasif, whatever you can do, make sure Henry survives. Okay, so Henry had a lame leg. He had a bad leg. And he had an infection and they couldn't get the right medicines. So he always had a limp, which made me think of this book and my dad in two ways. One, there was somebody who had an impairment who did survive. I'm not sure he survived till the end, but the way people covered for each other, the way people stood next to each other, the camaraderie is so beautifully explained in this book. And I'm going to just tell you two things and then I'll get off. The thing that it just made me realize why this book is so spectacular, because it talks about the dignity that the survivors maintained while these animals tried to make them into animals. And he made lots of references to that. So the dignity of standing next to each other, of holding each other up, of lying next to each other in the barracks and making sure they transmitted some warmth so that they could survive. The question of survival, back to my dad, they stood next to Uncle Henry because when Mengele came, they covered his lame leg. I mean, my Uncle Henry did survive with my dad. And the last thing I'm going to say, related to the dignity and the unbelievable compassion survivors had for one another, and I was going to quote,
Th-
he who
Thank
has
you.
a why, he who has a why to live for, that enabled survivors to live. And that's why I think my dad survived, because his purpose was to make sure Henry survived. Thank you for
Thank you,
listening.
Frida. That
Thank
was a
you.
really nice point. I'm going to get to some of the comments in the chat. Someone said that the book represents practical, universal ideas. Another person said there's meaning in the suffering in life. We are trying to understand through this book how the Holocaust was able to progress to the cost of 6 million plus Jews. And an interesting point, what's different about this book is his perspective as a psychiatrist. Very, very fascinating, his take on human behavior.
I noticed that too. I think that he sort of goes back and forth between a kind of clinical looking at it as if he's not there, but then really talking about it as if he is. I actually found his descriptions of the men and himself in camp life to be very raw. For example, on the one hand, he described that primitive need for disregarding anything not serving the purpose of really saving one's own skin. He told a story about a really brave and dignified man who cried one morning because he couldn't get his shoes on. They had shrunken too much. He couldn't get his shoes on, and he was going to have to go to the snowy marching grounds in his bare feet. And in that moment, Frankl talks about himself and that he found comfort in a crumb of bread that he found in his pocket, that he munched with what he called absorbed delight. So I'm curious, what you think about his descriptions of camp life and what it did to people. And I just want to contrast that, think about that question and contrast that he also talked about seeing the truth for the first time, that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which a man can aspire. So I'm interested in hearing what you think of his depictions and his observations.
I have one comment in the chat, and then we'll see if some participants raise their hand. Someone said, I don't think we can understand camp life. Delight in a crumb? We think we do. Do we?
So that was me, and I live in Ecuador, and we have a lot of incredible poverty here that I didn't experience on the same level in Chicago by any stretch of the imagination, which is really why I come at it from that question, from that perspective, because I see people here, especially the Venezuelans who have come in since the collapse of their lives. And it's something that, as a person from the United States, I still, many years in, I just can't make it fit into my brain what I see. And what I see is not even remotely touching upon the horrors of the Holocaust. I just see Latin America and the way it exists.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, especially for those of us here in the United States. Any other thoughts about his depictions of camp life and of what it did to the people who were there?
Could I say something?
Please.
One of the things that I read, and I think he wrote this about 75 years ago, was that there's two types of races. There's the races of the decent people and the race of the indecent people. And when you think about that, I think that could be applied to today. There were evidently a very few good, decent Nazi officials in the Holocaust camps. Most of them were indecent. And that was his comment, that there are decent people and indecent people. And I found that very interesting, and I think it could be applied to society today.
Yeah, thank you. So that makes me wonder, when he talks about decent people and indecent people, he also believed very strongly in reconciliation and not revenge. And he renounced the idea of collective guilt, in fact. He said, I do not forget any good deed, and I do not carry a grudge for a bad one. So I'm curious how we sort of reconcile his sort of dividing people up into decent and indecent, and then also having this belief in reconciliation. What do you think about his commentary on that?
Was that after he was liberated? I didn't read the end of the book. He talks about reconciliation. Could you be more specific? Among who?
Sure. I think that my interpretation, I'm certainly open to other people's as well, but my interpretation is that he felt that it was sort of never too late, that someone could always move forward and always move on. And I think he applied that both in terms of his ideas about finding meaning, even through suffering, even in a situation that you couldn't control, but that also he wanted other people to be able to find that meaning as well. So I think that's where it seems to me that belief in reconciliation came from.
So Lori, in the chat, I think Jay Sorkin is agreeing with you. He says, we've read so much about suffering in the camps as being something that was absorbed. Here he approaches it from the point of view that they had a choice to have agency in their suffering, to have agency in an environment designed to prevent it.
Mm-hmm. Which sort of feels fundamental, right, to his thinking. I also saw a comment, and I'm not sure if I can scroll back to it. Yeah, from Christopher McCarthy, who said, this book made me who I am today, a licensed professional counselor, and that this book guides you in your practice and is your sole theoretical orientation. I'm wondering if, I can't see you because there are too many people on here, but Christopher, would you want to speak up and talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to our first question about when we first read it, I can't quite remember. I think it was about 10 years ago when I was in junior college. And prior to that, I had aspired to be a teacher. And then I switched over my major to psychology and subsequently went on to get my master's. And now I work for a large corporation, but I also work in the school system. So I've been doing that for 5 or 6 years now. And this book has always been in the back of my mind, sort of. And of course, you learn about other orientations like CBT, that's all the rage, dialectical behavioral therapy, it's all the rage. I do incorporate some of those things into it, but my baseline is always going to be this book because it has actually helped me with some of the things that I struggled with when I was younger. And so I find purpose and I also find happiness in being able to help other people and to teach them to find meaning in their own life. Whether, for me, it is helping others, but meaning can be found anywhere. And that's what I like about this book. The fact that Frankl doesn't just say, well, the meaning of life is to help others. And for me, it is. But for many of my students, it is not. Or at least maybe they don't know it yet. But I just find life to be quite a lot easier when you focus on helping other people. And it also helps you overcome a lot of your own obstacles, which I believe Frankl did. And it's pretty awesome. I just finished this like literally 10 minutes again for only the second time that I've read it. So I was really happy to be invited to this. And I'm happy that you all are here.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that.
Lori, we do have a hand raised. Lauren Kerr.
Right.
Hi. Yeah, my name's Lauren Karen. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm stuck, Lori, on your question about reconciliation.
Mm.
And I just first want to qualify this by saying that there is, until very recently, she just recently died, a place in Terre Haute, Indiana. Some of you guys might know about it. A fairly small town that had a wonderful Holocaust museum of sorts. And she made peace.
Mhm.
She was, do you remember her? Is it Comer?
Eva Core, is that Eva Core?
Eva Core.
It is. It is.
Candles, the Candles Museum?
Yes, candles. Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
And she, just for you guys who don't know about it, and she was one of twins and one of Mengele's horrible victims. And she made peace with a Nazi camp person, and it offended many, many people who couldn't. And she explained why. So I just want to put that on the side and then say to you, how, and you didn't use the word forgiveness, which is interesting. And she and Eva did use the word forgiveness quite a bit. But how does one reconcile with moment after day after week after month of torture because your feet are killing you and you're out in the snow or whatever it is that is one is trying to live with the suffering? How does one, I'm sure the words are not make peace. I don't know what the words are. How does one do that? What does one say to oneself? Is it at the moment? Is it afterwards? What?
I'd love to throw that out to the group and to say, you know, what did you read in this book? What do you think Frankl's, you know, wrestling with, and what does he have to say about that?
Susan, I see your hand up if you want to unmute yourself. There you go.
If you carry the bad things with you through your life, you are perpetuating what happened. And if you want to move on in your own life and be able to live a full life, you have to find some way to make peace with the bad things that happened. They don't always have to be quite as severe as what we know happened in the camps, but it's a philosophy that all of us can use to better our own lives. Just seeking the peace so that moving forward, we're not wasting the rest of our life on the past. We're not forgetting, but we're not. Okay.
Susan, I get that. I agree that one indeed needs to find their way of, again, I'm floundering, making peace with what's happened so that they can go on and live a full life. What about at the moment?
I believe Frankl was perhaps saying that if you don't forgive, it just eats you up and destroys who you are and only amplifies what they were trying to do to take away the dignity of these people. And if I could just read from page 90 to 91, a short part. They must not lose hope, but should keep their courage in the certainty that the hopelessness of our struggle did not detract from its dignity and its meaning. I said that someone looks down on each of us in difficult hours, a friend, a wife, somebody alive or dead, or a God. And he would not expect us to disappoint him. He would hope to find us suffering proudly, not miserably, knowing how to die.
I'm going to read some comments from the chat because I think they contribute to the conversation. Another way of saying what Susan just said is that you forgive others for yourself, not them. And someone on an iPad said you can demand accountability at the same time as you forgive.
I see two hands raised. First, I see Jay Fridovich, and then next, Cecilia. You're up next, Cecilia.
Me now?
Okay, why don't you go first since you're on mute, and then Jay Fridovich, if you want to unmute yourself for the next comment.
Okay, what I want to emphasize here is that as Frankl and Eva, they all talked about personal forgiveness. They did not said that this has to be collective. And this is based on Frankl's idea that we make our own choices. That when we find the meaning of life, it's when we are trying to make our own choices. So it's very important to understand that this is about personal and not collective. And
We lost you.
Jay Fridovich, you're up.
Okay. I read the book about 50 years ago the first time as a freshman in college, and then subsequently a few more times.
You lost me?
That the gift that Frankl gives us is pointing out to everyone that in any circumstance, not just the concentration camp, that self-determination is something that everyone possesses. And I think that is a strength that he points out, that we can find meaning in everything, that there's a choice we always have. And I think that that's also something that was so significant because at the time that he wrote his book, which even preceded his entrance into the concentration camp, he had begun his work. The other theorists were all talking about the weaknesses of people. People like Freud and others were talking about what was wrong with us and our weakness. And Frankl points out our strengths. So I think that that's really what makes him so exceptional. And that's the gift that I think he gave everyone, and why his book is still so widely read today. I've taught, in high school and in college, and it's been so well received by students of all different backgrounds. I've worked with folks who are in prison and have shared Frankl's message with them. And I just don't know anyone who doesn't view his message as having some meaning.
I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to comment on something I see in the chat from Iris, that he also talked about suffering and finding a reason to continue to live. And he gave the example of the rabbi who couldn't find meaning in his life after his wife and children died in the camps. And that he helped the rabbi see that he survived to see his family again, for example, in the world to come. And I think, Frankl states that to choose one's attitude in any given situation is the last human freedom. And that, again, we can't avoid suffering, but that even in, extreme suffering, we have the choice as to how we want to manage that. And I think we can probably all agree that's sort of a very central belief of his. But getting back to what we were talking about before, I'd like to ask the question. So according to Frankl, responsibility goes hand in hand with freedom. And he apparently, when he spoke, he used to say, we have the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast, we ought to have the Statue of Responsibleness on the West Coast. So how do you see the interplay between responsibility and finding purpose? In other words, I mean, what I would add to that to sort of, suss it out a little bit further is he really sort of had the belief that I think he said somewhere, it's not just what you expect from life, it's what life expects from you. So he only talked a little bit about purpose, but he took it a step further, I think, and commented also on, you have a responsibility to figure out what your purpose is. It's not just you don't just have like an option. In his viewpoint, at least I read it that way. I'm wondering what people think about that idea that you have a responsibility to find out your purpose.
There's something in the chat that might respond to that. Jane said Frankl talked about getting through his work by having a conversation with his wife. He allowed himself to do what he needed to survive. So his responsibility was to just survive, and he did that. So there's also some comments regarding the earlier conversation that finding peace and purpose is not the same as forgiveness. I thought that was an interesting distinction and particularly relevant. So
If I could just read 3 things that he said about human potential: turning suffering into a human achievement and accomplishment, which he did by trying to build up and encourage the others. Number 2, deriving from guilt the opportunity to change oneself for the better, and perhaps that relates more to what he went through after he was set free. And number 3, deriving from life's transitoriness and incentive to take responsible action.
Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to talk a little bit more about that? Thoughts about that?
I wouldn't mind weighing in on your question, Lori. So for me, what I think he means by responsibleness is leaving your mark or your legacy on what you want your life to be about. And so that's how I read it. So for instance, for me, I just want to influence as many people to try to help others in the same way that I do. And I think that it was in contrast to, I think he was trying to distinguish himself from Freud, who had suggested in some ways that human beings were more so searching for pleasure, like we discussed earlier, than purpose. And when you find your purpose, it can mean that you are, in fact, having an impact. And he talked about it could just be finding love too, and the people around you or your children. It could be really anything, but your responsibility is your legacy that you leave on the world, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Other thoughts?
It reminds me of the woman who had tried to commit suicide because her child had died, but she had a surviving child who had special needs, and he helped her realize that, and she realized that having the responsibility of that child gave her a purpose in life, that she felt like her life had no purpose, but that taking care of her child was making her life worthwhile.
Thank you.
And then he took everything that he had been through to develop logotherapy. So it seems like that's bringing everything full circle to see the purpose in what he had been through and how to develop it to help others.
Mm-hmm.
So couple of things in the chat. I love that question. I feel we're all responsible for each other. And one of my purposes in life is living that value. This person is feeding the hungry and doing things in her own life. Frankl made the point that in the face of losing control of virtually every aspect of one's life, the freedom to choose how you respond to the situation and how one feels and even deals with the situation, perhaps in defiance of the unspeakable atrocity one finds themselves in, it provides the only freedom one can assert. It could be that serving what life wants of us removes some egotism and contributes meaning. And then there is a comment, I'm not sure if people feel qualified or comfortable, but the question is, can you please comment on putting Frankl's philosophy in the context of folks with clinical depression or chemical imbalance? So I'll leave that to the.
I might comment on that to start with, and then I'll be open to other thoughts on it. So he does talk about, feeling like he made such a difference with people who were depressed, and that he had the ability to do that by sort of cutting right to helping them sort of find their potential purpose in life. But I mentioned at the beginning that there were also some criticisms. There are some criticisms of his theories. And I think that this is sort of an interesting place maybe to discuss that. So one of the criticisms is that just because a small fraction of people could manage to control their attitude in the face of this extreme suffering, it doesn't necessarily prove that all people can. So potentially, maybe it's not universal. That's a criticism. Another one is, the implication that a positive attitude is essential for survival, and that consequently, might that imply that those who died gave up and were somehow responsible for their fate? And I think thirdly, exactly what you're asking, there is the belief that there are some situations, and a chemical imbalance causing depression, for example, might be one of them, and was one of them that I think is mentioned in some of the criticism that I've read, that, is it possible that this just really can't help everybody? Can it help someone with depression? I would think absolutely. Can it help everyone with depression? So I'm going to throw out, these are some of the criticisms of his work. I don't know that I have the answer to that exact question. I'd like to see if other people, what you think of those criticisms, and if you think that those, if you can accept some parts of this, perhaps without accepting the whole. Lauren Kerr has her hand up.
Here we go. Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I thought about that as I was reading. When Frankl would give various examples, I was thinking sometimes, what about somebody who doesn't have some of the things that he identified especially in his case examples, as those very things that kept people going and kept him going. So what if you were in a camp and you had no family and a crappy childhood, and you did not have a wife? And I think he even said at one point, tell me if this is right, you guys, I think he even said at one point, I didn't want to know whether she was still alive or not, because I held on to her, our memories, my image of her, I'm sure, hope of reunification, his wife. But what if you were missing all of the things that he used in his case examples? And, in a way, it's almost like the concept in 12-step groups, you guys know, of
Right.
a higher power. That is, the higher power is the higher power you create and you devise. Well, what if one can't find a higher power? I mean, what if, I don't know, what if you cannot create for yourself the why to keep living?
Mm-hmm. There's some great comments in the chats.
And one of them might be right there to take care of the guy next to you in the bunk. I don't know.
I think you raise great questions. Any other thoughts?
Susan Efron.
Well, I feel that there's never one solution for everybody. Everybody has to find what works for them. And what Frankl did was he put out there lots of things for us to discuss, as we're realizing in this discussion we're having now. Thoughts, things to think about, separating yourself a little bit from your depression, trying to see ways in which to better your life. And I just think, when you work in psychology, there's several theories, and you can believe on one, or you can believe on all of them, or one you like better than another. There's no one size fits all in this when you're talking about human beings. So I think we should take from this book the pluses that we can find, And then each person will find different pluses, and that's what the book is all about.
I love that you're taking us back to, and I'd like to sort of throw this out to people, what was the most impactful takeaway for you from this book? Denise Babbitts?
Hi there. I can't really answer your question, but one of the things that I wanted to say was that, he didn't touch too much upon those that didn't survive or who might have decided for themselves, as he did say that there were decisions that you make and that there's a certain freedom in that moment by moment. To me, to make the decision for oneself as a final act of personal freedom to perhaps decide to end one's life doesn't mean that it didn't give them meaning or they weren't or that they failed to survive. I think that for me, that's one of the criticisms that I have of this theory. I can't find a lot of criticism in it, but that is one thing. And I know that he was just focusing on the survival aspect, but I think that that's one of the questions that arises in my mind, is that of those people who perhaps decided using their own last bit of personal freedom to not go on.
It seems that the important thing is focus on the sanctity of life. And as far as there was a turning point, it seems like for him on page 96 and 97, he says, at that moment, there was very little I knew of myself or of the world. I had but one sentence in mind, always the same. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. How long I knelt there and repeated this sentence, memory can no longer recall, but I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started.
Thank you. I see a comment from Christopher that I think is really interesting and I think really, really important. Christopher is saying that you suggest that there isn't one therapy, that one therapy, one medication, one philosophy that can help you overcome depression. Instead, a combination of a few might help. And I think that makes so much sense. You'd never focus on only medication or only therapy. Medication doesn't work alone. Therapy is always recommended, and using logotherapy, it sounds like, in particular, from your point of view, is helpful hand in hand. And I think we know probably some things that we didn't know when he wrote this book in the late 40s, mid 40s, in terms of treatment for certain things. So I think that's really a great point to mention.
Yeah, Laurie, there's a comment by Marcy Bloom earlier on that says perhaps survival wasn't always the issue in the camps, and I think this goes back to the question about those that didn't survive, but compassion, dignity, and humanity for others were. After all, survival was so painful. So, there is a different definition of meaning. And then I'm hearing from Sarah Werson that she has a comment. So Sarah, would you like to go?
Thank you. What I take away from this the most, other than the fact that my grievances are really tiny compared to what he went through, and that I can really learn a lot from this, is that one of the most powerful experiences that helped him was being able to visualize being with his wife. He would see her, he would talk with her. And because I recently read a book by Natan Sharansky, his first book, Fear No Evil, he did that too. And what struck me about that is how important it is to have an inner life, a spiritual life, an intellectual life, but an inner life where you can actually be with this person that you're separated from. So that's my comment.
A big takeaway for you from this. Thank you. Anyone else? What were your big takeaways from this? What did Frankl say that you maybe haven't seen or heard anywhere else that speaks to you? Jay, I don't know if Jay Fridovich has got your hand up.
I do. I just think that the idea that in any situation, we always have some degree of choice. And I think that again is the gift he's trying to give us all.
Mhm.
In any situation. And it doesn't necessarily mean survival. I don't think he was looking down at those that didn't survive. I don't think that they were failures in his theory.
Mhm.
I also agree with what someone said earlier, that there's not any one theory that speaks to every situation either. But I do feel that the biggest takeaway of Frankl is the gift he gives everyone is that in any situation, we have choice, we have some dignity, we can try to make, I don't know if the word, make the best of any situation. I read another Holocaust situation. It had nothing to do with Frankl, but somebody was talking about as being starving in a concentration camp, and he picked up blades of grass and decided that what made him feel like a human being was exercising the choice of which blade of grass he was going to eat, even though he knew he was starving to death. But he said exercising that choice. And it was not something that Frankl had written. But when I read it, it certainly reminded me of Frankl. And again, that issue of choice, somebody gave the term earlier in the conversation tonight, dignity. It gives you dignity, it gives you humanity when you have some degree of choice. And even if it means a choice in how one decides to end their life or, you know, in any situation, what you do with it, choice that you have and you can exercise is, I think, you know, one of the lasting images and messages that Frankl gives us.
Thank you. Very, very powerful thoughts.
Thank you. Dolores had wanted to speak and had raised her hand via the chat. Dolores?
As a therapist, I think logotherapy would well be used as a final thing that a person could make some decisions. But when someone comes to you with a problem, you need to know, you know, where it came from, because our early lives have a great deal to do with our development and the way we live in the present. So I found that logotherapy was when one found what caused their depression or their in not being able to you know, live life the way they wanted to, then logotherapy comes in, and you can then decide on the meaning of life for yourself.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here and turn to a couple of different things, if we have time, that Frankl said. Here was one, quoting from him: "Some men lost all hope, but it was the incorrigible optimists who were the most irritating companions." What do you make of this, especially in light of his belief in tragic optimism, which is optimism in the face of tragedy? Some men lost all hope, but it was the incorrigible optimists who were the most irritating companions. Trudy. You see Trudy's hand up?
Well,
now
we're
can you hear
waiting.
me? Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment on the role of teachers and parents and how important that they could be informing the individual to help them see their inner self and find resources to character build, to build on their character. And if this occurs in the schools and at young ages with parents, then they will grow into adults that will have resources.
Yeah. So that's a great takeaway. Thank you.
Thanks. I have someone who's looking to make a comment. Jane H., do you want to talk to Lori's question on Optimus?
Yeah, so I put that in before, but the Optimus thing is so interesting because my first husband, when he decided he wanted to get a divorce, he said to me, "You wake up happy every day. Do you know how annoying that is?" And I was like, no, I actually don't, but good to know. So maybe when you just don't feel it at that moment, it's just too annoying to have people saying, "It'll be fine." I don't know. I don't know. But my friend who says she knows me, it is so annoying. Okay, good to know. But the other thing about choice that I think it was Jay was saying, and a few people mentioned, and logotherapy, and Christopher, going back to you working with teenagers, I have 2 teenagers, and I will say the thing that makes them so miserable is not being able to make their own decisions. And I also recall speaking with a client who'd been arrested and spent the night in jail, or 2 nights in jail. They took her phone away. She couldn't choose what to eat. They asked her if she needed medications, and she said yes. And then they took her to the hospital and forced her to take the medications when she didn't want. Like, losing choice is kind of miserable no matter what situation, like the Holocaust, the pandemic, being a teenager and your parents make your decisions, like it's just miserable for people.
Thank you. Great observation. Thank you. I see a couple other hands up. I just want to throw this out there because we're getting close to the end. Is there anyone who hasn't participated that would like to make a comment, something you'd like to share? I'm not seeing any new. I don't know if Mercy or Wendy, if you are. I'm not seeing any new.
I'm doing a quick visual to see if anyone's raised their hand visually. I'm not seeing anything either, but thank you for asking that question.
So what do you think about Frankl's maxim? Live life as if it's the second time and you acted wrongly the first time. Is Janine raising her hand? Her actual hand?
My second time.
Go ahead, Janine.
She's on mute. Is Janine on mute? You need to unmute.
Why don't we let someone else take it and then we'll work to get Janine.
So live life as if it's the second time and you acted wrongly the first time.
This is Lauren again. May I jump in?
Please, yes.
I think it's a fascinating question. I think it's related to how would you correct your mistakes? Or if it were tomorrow that you had the chance, and maybe we all do in some important respects, how will you live tomorrow differently? What will you take care of? What will you repair? Who will you speak to? How small things and big things. If you could redo not if you could, let's all presume we can in some important ways. Tomorrow, how will we live differently if you decide to take that chance?
Thank you. Iris, are you raising your hand?
I think the idea is not to even think about the mistakes, but to start with a clean slate and not dwell on the things that we may have done wrong, maybe learn from that, yes, but move forward in a way that doesn't, I mean, it's, I guess, well, now I'm thinking about it, it's good to have the experience, but at the same time, if the experience colors how you're going to react, that maybe it's good to start fresh without that background, without the baggage.
Wow. And I am looking at the clock. We are down to our last couple of minutes. So Iris, thank you so much for that. And I really want to thank everyone for an incredibly thought-provoking conversation that I feel like we could have continued on so many levels for so much longer. So I really want to thank you all for participating tonight. It's certainly given me so much more to think about from this book after combing through it. I'd like to throw out to you just a question to maybe take away with you after we close the Zoom. If we aren't living the life we want, what are we going to do about it? So I'll leave you with that and turn it over to Wendy or Marcy.
Hi, thank you so much, Lori. Some wonderful feedback in the chat. You're a wonderful moderator, and we are grateful to have you this evening on our museum team as a docent and this book club tonight. Thank you everyone for coming. I just put in the chat a link to our events page, and I hope you'll join us for some upcoming programs. I want to mention that on Tuesday, January 26th, we have a wonderful program, our Ellen V. and Philip L. Glass Holocaust Commemorative Series for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a wonderful diary called Renya's Diary. So join us for that program. Many of you might have already heard it, but it's an incredible diary. And then looking forward, we have our wonderful Mandela Struggle for Freedom exhibition, which is coming to us from the Canadian Human Rights Museum. Our opening program is on February 18th. I hope you'll check that out and join us. And then finally, our next book club that is connected to our upcoming exhibition. It's on Tuesday, February 16th, right before the opening. Join Lena Kaplan, who will be discussing The Prison Letters of Nelson Mandela, which is by Nelson Mandela and edited by Sam Ventnor. Thank you for joining us. Have a great night. We hope to see you again in person soon.
I have one last comment. There was a bit of conversation about Eva Core earlier in our session, and I'd like to let people know that in our Survivor Stories experience theater, Eva Core is one of the interactive holograms that we feature. So you can check our the holograms change monthly, but if you check our website, and when Eva Core is the featured survivor and we are open once again, which hopefully is coming soon, you can visit our museum and actually ask the hologram of Eva Core questions, which she will answer in her own voice. So have a great evening, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at a program or at our next book club in early February.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Night.
Bye.